I'm Matt.
And I'm Nate.
And this is Not Quite Religious, a podcast where a Christian pastor and former evangelical turned atheist have conversations about faith, religion, philosophy, and life while drinking coffee.
Welcome to episode 24, where we talk about food, the transcendent, and possibly Chesterton. We'll find out.
I don't think we're going to get to Chesterton today.
We might. Who knows?
Except right now, at this very moment, that we're actually talking about him. But first, the coffee, right?
Yeah.
So I made my own blend today, which is a bit misleading because I didn't actually roast the beans.
Right.
I just took beans.
You took multiple roasted beans. And
I took the beans from Mocha Joe's that they had roasted and put together my own thing, which, you can only do if you buy your coffee whole bean like I do.
No, you can do it ground. You just have to do a lot of different.
That's true. It's not the same, I don't think.
Yeah.
And so I just got two of their single origin and put it together, and I'm interested to see what the
It's definitely good.
Profile
I still think that Keen coffee has been my favorite so far.
Yeah, that's good stuff, Terra Nova.
Yeah.
I'm taking my first sip right now. It's okay. I still haven't perfected French press. Part of the problem is that I have a one-track mind. I can only do a thing at once.
Yeah.
And when I first get here, I was single-minded today on making the coffee, and Nate was asking me about the drive down and all the small talk. So
I distracted you.
I was a bit distracted, as was the same last week. So
I think also you prefer a drip, and I prefer a French press, so that it changes how small your grind has to be.
Yeah, I do. Right, so I do a pour over at home, which I do. So I make it to the cup.
Yeah,
and when I grind it, I just it's a habit. You just feel how long.
Yeah, you have muscle memory.
Yeah, and then French press, you don't need to grind it as long because
you don't want sitting in there.
You don't want it to go through the holes on the French press. It needs to be a little bit coarser for French press, and so the last 2 weeks I've ground it a little too fine, but that's okay.
Yeah, it's still tasty.
Yeah,
it's got caffeine. Not Dunkin' Donuts that I'm aware of.
No, the bags are right there. So
yeah, I mean you could. I mean it would be a lot of work, but you could take an empty bag, throw some other beans in there.
That could happen. Yeah. But fooling you is not near as fun as fooling me.
It's true.
Because I'm the coffee snob.
Yeah. I mean, I used to be more of a coffee snob. Like when I was a pastor and went to coffee shops to write my sermons and meet people, I was way more of a coffee snob.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How many... I know maybe this is off topic, but it feels like it might be on topic. Or at least a segue into one. How many pastors do you think do that? Is that like a cliche for
do what? Meet people in a coffee shop?
Yeah, meet people in a coffee shop.
100%. That's actually not true. I think 100% of Acts 29 and new church planners who want to be relevant. My guess is the old 65-year-old pastor in an established church that's, First Baptist, Second Baptist, or wherever, with not a fancy name, probably meet people in their office.
Yeah, in Brattleboro, it's people are often surprised if they're extroverts and they stop and ask, "Hey, what are you working on? What am I typing?" Which is kind of always the hope.
Yeah.
Then when I tell them I'm a minister, they're usually intrigued, surprised. At least maybe they're feigning intrigue. They might have other feelings.
I don't know. I think you're like a unicorn up in Brattleboro.
Yeah, right? yeah. So, but maybe in a bigger setting in a bigger city, they don't see that kind of thing as often.
I think they just don't talk to you in a big city.
Yeah, right.
Like no one's saying hi to you in New York.
Right.
They're
not. There's no intrigue.
Yeah.
Right. It's
they're also
anybody could be anything.
They're just not friendly. And I mean, partially it's because there's so many people. You hang out in you're friends with people in your building or your little block,
right?
And then someone's new until you see them multiple times and realize they're a new neighbor. You're like,
nobody in Manhattan's got time for anybody in Manhattan.
right. Yeah, pretty much.
This is how that goes. But I was just thinking, like, am I part of, is this one of those situations where I think I'm doing something cutting edge by sitting in a coffee shop and typing sermons when really it's just like the thing that everybody under 40 who's a pastor does?
Yeah, I think it's what everyone does. Like, it was cutting edge in like 96. Listening to Jesus for you.
When I was 12.
Yes.
So we wanted to talk about the transcendence of food.
Yeah, which we hit before in the episode no one got to listen to because it was just radio silence.
Yeah, and then we forgot how we segued from Dr. Horrible to transcendence of food and did a Dr. Horrible episode, which I think is
last week.
Yeah. Or
I guess it won't be last week when we...
Yeah.
It'll be like 4 weeks ago.
Right. and we forgot how we segued from Dr. Horrible to food.
Yeah. I mean, our first Dr. Horrible was also, I think we did a better capture of the magic of Dr. Horrible singing monologue the first time. But.
Yeah. So Nate is a total foodie.
I mean, it's my job.
Yeah, but even if it wasn't.
Yeah, that's probably true. Yeah.
But it is your job because, like...
I love it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and, like, I've worked with a lot of cooks and I've worked with a lot of chefs, and I like to consider myself a chef. And what I mean is, like, there were institutions I worked at where, like, the people don't really care that much about food, or some of them, and they're just, like, there to pull out sheet trays of chicken, and everything's overcooked, and they're just like, whatever, I get paid this much an hour, and this is just, like, what I do. But if they could have just as easily gone into construction or some other manual labor, and, like, it wouldn't be a big deal. And then there are people who, like, dream about food. Who, like, even in the institutional setting are like, how can I make this the best possible thing? Like, trying to think about new techniques and new recipes and talking with other people, about food. And I like to consider myself the latter, I think.
Yeah, and for you, it's not just... I mean, it's one thing to say, it's kind of a derogatory thing to tell somebody, hey, you like food. That's not what we mean. Like, right? Like, it's not... It's more than just the taste of it or that it fills the need for sustenance for you. There's a whole culture to it.
Yeah. Yeah, when I started at the Lord Jeff, which is now 30 Boltwood, which at the time was one of the best fine dining establishments in the area, and we actually were rated as one of the top 10 wedding destinations by Town and Country magazine. And part of that was because we were putting out such amazing food, even at wedding level. So people were, like, getting my story, and this is probably a year and a half after I lost my faith. Maybe a year. It's hard because I was unemployed for 6 months because no one knows what a church planter / pastor does. So I'm, like, interviewing for jobs, and they're like, so what is it you do? Right? It's just very much like Office Space. Like, so what is it you do here? And then Sarah got some jobs, and I got a dishwasher position from there. And after my one dishwasher shift, became a prep cook. And after, like, a week of prep cook, was, like, line cook, and then ultimately, like, sous chef. And that's when they were closing, and the Jeff needed someone, so I went over to the Jeff. And so while in there, I'm, like, telling my story to the new people because they didn't really know. And Chef Sarah Klein was like, so you left one cult for another, huh? And, I think, especially when you're in the upper level fine dining, it really, it's not necessarily a cult because there's no, like, pressure on you to lose your family and stuff if you leave. But there is, like, a very intense relationship and immersion into a culture that if you want to make it, and you don't want to be just a cook, and you want to, like, climb the ranks and get some like visibility, you kind of need to learn to eat, sleep, dream, food. I guess eat food, but you know, it's more than just, oh, we'll add some salt and do the thing. You're like really thinking through like, all right, so what's seasonal, what's artisanal, what's gonna lift this up. I mean, there's one of the books that I have that I was told to get is the Flavor Bible.
Yeah.
And it is literally a list of almost every ingredient you can think of, and next to that ingredient is every other ingredient that pairs with it. So you're like, all right, I want to do a pork loin dish, and you look up pork loin.
Yeah.
And then it like lists all the food, and it lists like the season, the heat, the warmth, like all these attributes about the heaviness or lightness about a thing. So you can literally come up with a dish like on the fly, because you like look up pork, and then you're like, okay, it goes with apples. So you look up apples, and you're like, oh, cinnamon, like, and you just like kind of go like that until you've constructed, you know, a plate of food that hopefully is delicious and beautiful and somewhat unique.
Yeah. I remember going to the Jeff with you one time for lunch, and
that's before I worked there, probably.
I think it was after. I think it was after you worked there, or during. Maybe it was during. It was like your day off, and this is how not much of a foodie I am. I'm like, they have ramen here, and you're like, it's real ramen.
Yeah,
it's not Mauritian.
Yeah. So that must have been while I was still working there, and Dino was the chef, and he's like, amazing.
And he's like, and you were like, no, you actually got to have the ramen. It was the pork belly ramen. I remember it, and I was like, this has to be like 1,000,000 calories, and you were like, yeah, it's good food. It's 1,000,000 calories. You should get it.
Yeah.
I'm like, oh, okay. So I can't put my health food Brattleboro hat on.
Yeah, I mean, yes and no. So, like, at fine dining, you're getting way more salt and butter than you should probably have.
Yeah.
But also, like, at least when I was at the Jeff, we just used real, like, food.
Yeah.
Like, even our pasta, we made from scratch. So it was like flour, water, egg.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so on that level, like, it is sort of healthy eating. And, like, the ramen broth, we would have, like, you know, made the dashi, which is kombu and bonito flakes. So it's, like, tuna scales and seaweed. Let's do that. And then we probably didn't make ramen noodles. But then, like, pork belly and a 60-minute egg is my guess, and some scallions and probably some mushrooms. Like, I don't know. It's like,
yeah, I couldn't believe how good it was.
Yeah.
I was like, I felt that something had been kept from me. Like, I felt lied to by society.
Right.
That there was food out there that was that good.
Yeah. So
like,
when I staged at the Jeff, which a stage is like you work for free for a restaurant for a day, and they decide if you're good enough for them, and you decide if they're good enough for you. So I was at a Rise, which was another fine dining establishment, but also a pizza place. It was tapas and pizza, but they tried to do everything right. Like, we made everything. We even made our mozzarella sticks from scratch and tried to fancy them up. Like, I thought I could cook. And then I staged at the Jeff, and I was like, I have no idea what I'm doing, but I know I want to be here, because they had immersion cookers and sous vide, and we're doing like molecular gastronomy, and this is 10 years ago, so it was like essentially cutting edge. I had only seen these things on like Top Chef, and all of a sudden, like, they're making foams, and like, I'm just like, oh my gosh, like, this is next level. I want to know how to do this.
Right.
So they were like, so you just kind of want to like do the brunch shift on Sundays because you're working at a Rise? And I was like, nope, I want in. And that was that.
Yeah. So there's like, there's two ways of talking about the same thing, in this case, food, right? So you could talk about the recipe itself.
Yeah.
Right? You could go all the way down to the chemicals. Probably you have this knowledge.
Sure.
You could talk about exactly why scientifically, if you mix that with that, it'll taste good, and why these two things don't work chemically. Yeah. Like, we can talk about food in a very scientific way. And yet we can also talk about food or almost anything in this very romantic sort of way. We could talk about it in terms of culture or just in terms of why there are people that are foodies versus why there are people that are not, like how that even happens. And I think that's kind of a microcosm of the dynamic of our podcast, except that like I think you are capable of wearing more hats than me, or I'm like consistently like, let's talk about the transcendent aspects. Let's talk about like the super rational romantic things. Like you can kind of go back and forth between those two things, but there is an element to it of irrationality.
Yeah, I sort of. You had me till the very last sentence.
Yeah.
So like with the transcendent, like yeah, you're right. Like we can talk about ramen and it can like list the ingredients like bonito flakes and kombu and garlic and scallion, and you boil that water and like there's a chemical reaction that pulls flavors out. But then also you're just like, someone lied to me about how good food can be. Right. And like knowing the recipe doesn't necessarily change that. In fact, like you could know all the ingredients in a dish, and you could have two dishes with the exact same ingredients, and first off, come up with completely different things. But one could be absolutely awful, and the other could be absolutely amazing. Mm-hmm. Right? So, like, ingredients, I guess, and even, like, how something's prepared don't necessarily give the whole picture. Like, there's a sum that's greater than the parts when it comes to at least my style of cooking.
Yeah. There's somehow like intuition is involved. I can compare it, I think, to sports, which is more up my alley. Like there's like Tom Brady is probably good. He's already considered the best quarterback, and he might be the best football player who's ever lived.
Yeah.
And he was drafted.
It's not LeBron James.
See, that's what I'm talking about. Like best versus greatest, right? Like if LeBron James and Tom Brady got in a fight, we know who'd win. If they raced, we know who'd win. If they played one-on-one in anything, we know who they win. Mm-hmm. They know they win. But like Tom Brady,
who would win in ping pong?
Like I feel like LeBron James might be too big for ping pong. That's a good question. But I don't think it's any major athletic feat. Well, then again, there's the... Anyway. This is how my brain works. I question myself immediately as words come out of my mouth. My point is, like, Tom's really slow and, like, looks funky. Mm-hmm. Like, and what makes him great is, in sports, they call it the it factor, which means they don't know.
Yeah.
Because there are people who every year they have these things called the NFL Combines where basically they're just testing people's athletic skills. Mm-hmm. And people are wowed by a guy's strength, by their speed, by their, agility. And then they draft them and they're not as good as this other guy that didn't do as well at the Combine. So they call it like that it factor. Yeah. Because it's something, I don't want to say irrational, but it's beyond the mind's capacity.
Measurement.
Yeah, like where what is that? And so I could compare that to the question of what makes food good. If you would think like, oh, if I just follow the recipe exactly the way this guy follows it, it's just about the recipe. But like, I don't know, maybe it's also about the tender loving care that
it's funny because
the energy that the chef puts into it.
Yeah. So Dino, when I worked at the Jeff, like he didn't use recipes. He would walk us through a dish. He's like, this is how you do it. And then you just like did it that way. But not always this, like each cook had a little bit of a different influence. So even like, right. Cause like he showed us, but how long you're sweating your shallots versus like, it's all like very slightly different. And I wonder if at Michelin star restaurants, it's more tight. I do know like in institutions, like when I worked at Smith or Amherst College, or Assumption, like you follow the recipe exactly. Mm-hmm. And the idea is, that it should taste the same every single time.
Yeah.
Whether that is true or not, because like, recipes are different when they're scaled. But I guess all that to say is I don't really like I was trained by Dino, so I don't really use recipes. I just like continually taste, and I'm like, oh, it needs this, oh, it needs this. And oftentimes people are like, how do you cook this? I'm like, I don't know, you cook it. And that's like an answer I got at the Jeff. I was like, how long should I think it was like duck confit, or it was something like I had heard of and seen but never made. And I was like, so how long do you cook it for? And they were like, till it's done.
Right.
Okay, but like, how long is that? Like, I don't know. It's like till it's done, dude.
But then it feels like an art rather than
I mean, fine dining, I think is
and I think part of the appeal of that, and you alluded to it just now, was part of the appeal is like everybody has their own sort of style.
Yeah, each artist is a little like
and that's a fun thing, not just because you get to carve out your own niche, but because you get to see how other people are different in their own way. I think of it in terms of music, how like songwriters admire other songwriters in the way that they write songs, the way that they write lyrics. Yeah, because they're like, I could never think of that, and it's always, as somebody who, from the outside, you go, well, yeah, you're both brilliant songwriters, and yet you're both envious of each other's style, and yet here we are, the rest of us, like envious of both of you, but you're not at all the same. So I think probably the same could be said of fine dining. It's like people who participate in fine dining probably can taste, like they take a bite of something and they're like, oh, that's Nate. That has, you know what I mean? Like that has Nate written all over it, or that's Cheryl, that has Cheryl written all over it, or whatever.
I guess the hard part, at least with fine dining for me, is when I worked at the Jeff, most of us were really strong cooks, but there were a few that weren't as strong, and you're just like, dude, you made that and it's awful. And probably not awful, right, for the average person, but you're like, that's not what we want to do here. Because like some people are better artists than others, I guess.
Yeah. And it's a weird thing. Like, is that about dedication? Is that about raw talent?
Probably a mixture of both. I mean, if I didn't have the raw talent at cooking, I wouldn't have made it at the Jeff. But also, like when I got to be the executive chef at Assumption University, like I thanked Dino, and he was like, "You were hungry for it, man." Mm-hmm. Right? He was like, "I was happy to mentor you." He's like, "But like, it's not me that got you that job. It's because you went after it." Yeah. And like you worked your butt off to get better at food and figure out what to like. So there were like 2 moments at the Jeff, like about 3 months in. So I cried every night at the end of my shift. Every night? For like a month. Because it was so intense. Mm-hmm. Like just always in the weeds. Like 5:30 was coming, that clock's running down, and I wasn't good enough yet to get everything done. And so like I was still having to prep while tickets were coming in. And about 3 months in, I figured it out. And Dino walks by and he tasted something. He goes, "That doesn't suck." And like that was like high praise from the chef. And then right before I left, I came up with my own appetizers by this point. And like me and some of the other chefs would like shoot ideas as we're online. We're like, "Oh, let's do this." Mm-hmm. And we would like write stuff on the board, and Dino would come in and be like, "Why do we need sunchokes?" I'm like, "Oh, because we had this idea." So I came up with this salad that was like relatively simple. It was like stuffed squash blossoms that were deep fried in a tempura and frisee and this and that. And I made a cilantro lime something vinaigrette, and Dino tasted it and he was like, "That's the best salad dressing I've ever had in my life." Okay, so if that doesn't suck is like from Dino, it was like compliment, then like this is the best salad dressing I've ever had is like, it was like a moment.
Yeah, it's like a foodie orgasm.
A foodgasm.
It's like, what level is that? Like, if that's crazy.
Yeah, those like 2 moments I remember. Mm-hmm. And like, the doesn't suck was like, okay, I got this, like I can do this job, and like best salad dressing ever, which like it's only salad dressing, but I was like, okay, I've hit like badass. And like when I worked there, I looked at these other guys and I was like, they're badass.
Yeah.
Like they could throw, like some of these guys, like Ryan and Walker could throw down I'm pretty sure in any restaurant in New York City.
Right.
Any Michelin star restaurant, like if you threw them in, they'd be in the weeds for a little bit, but they would like come out battle worn and scarred, but like ready to go.
Yeah.
And I think at this point I could do that. I couldn't have done that when I was at the jet. I'd be 2 hours in and I'd be like crying so hard. I'd be like, I'm going home, Jeff. And they'd be like, yeah, get out of here.
Yeah. So the only thing that I have to kind of compare it to, and I almost don't want to for various reasons, is like the crafting of sermons.
Yeah.
And we talked about that in an earlier podcast. How like I feel like sermoning is you're on dangerous ground when you start to think of like your sermons as a work of art. And I remember we talked about like you creating an entire service. Good Friday, and this whole. I don't know. I think that wasn't the. I don't think
that's coming out tomorrow.
Okay.
That's the title is Star Wars is all pew pew.
Oh, that was I think that's a different episode. But anyway, instead of talking about episodes, I just can't remember if that was the one that was radio silence for 50 minutes, so people might not even know what I'm talking about. But anyway, so like part of the craft of writing a sermon is just writing in general. Mm-hmm. So it's both things that I'm working on. For years, people have been like, you need to publish something, and for years I was like, for what? Like, I already kind of do write stuff for people, and it's already, I don't know, people think I should monetize a skill, and I get it. But what I've taken to doing, or I had this idea a couple weeks ago, because I write a lot of like, I don't know, I hope this doesn't sound like too over complimentary. What's the adjective? Thoughtful. I write long posts that people actually read. Yeah. On Facebook. More people read it on Facebook than they do on my blog. Mm-hmm. So I just keep it to Facebook.
I didn't even know you had a blog.
I do have a blog, but like I keep track of how many people actually read it.
That was also cutting edge in like 96.
And it's people read my Facebook posts. Yeah. More than people read my blog.
You got to get a YouTube channel.
Maybe so. That's a different medium, though.
It's true.
I think it's a different skill set. I feel like with YouTube, if I just learn the technical stuff of it, I could actually be like a really good YouTuber. Yeah. But I don't know if I could be a good YouTuber, a good podcaster, a good dad, and a good pastor. Yeah. Like, I don't know if I could be all those things.
You just kind of wrap the YouTube into the podcast.
Yeah.
Right? Mm-hmm. Like a 15-minute blurb by yourself about the podcast. Yeah, and then we just record the podcast and put it on YouTube so people can watch us actually sip the coffee, and we can prove and hold it up, and then we get sponsors, and we can wear today's episode is brought to you by
we can wear our matching t-shirts.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I the thing I can compare it to in terms of sermoning, because I wasn't officially trained as a writer, I was trained in how to write a sermon, but as of now I do not preach the way I was taught to preach. So in seminary, it was basically like figure out what the text is saying, do all the study in Greek and Hebrew, depending on whether you're doing Old Testament or New Testament. Figure out what you're going to say, and then organize it in a outline form. Yeah, and then throw some illustrations in there. Yeah. But basically give your audience your outline. Like, here's point A. Yeah. Yada, yada, yada. You could even put it on a PowerPoint. Right. So it's less like a TED Talk and more like a business presentation with like a few funny stories in between. Yeah. That was how I was taught to preach. And then that wasn't working for me at all when I was at Steamtown in Pennsylvania, and my colleague was like, very gently, you need to learn how to preach. which was like devastating to my psyche because it was something I thought that I was good at.
Yeah.
And I reached out to I reached out to a trial lawyer who does who like speaks to juries.
Mm-hmm.
And he taught me his method of preparing speeches, which for him were like 15 minutes, which I think is fine for a sermon, actually.
Yeah.
I think people that preach for an hour are crazy.
So what's funny is while you were talking, I was thinking about one of the Acts 29 boot camps I went to. I think it was one where I was like assessing other people. So Driscoll was still like kind of the man, and Chandler and some of these bigger names. And they all were like preaching for an hour, sometimes hour and a half.
Yeah.
And this other guy gets up and he's like, TED Talks are like the most popular thing right now. He's like, I preach for 15 minutes. And like people laughed and he's like, why are you laughing? You all watch TED Talks.
Right.
Like,
right. Yeah. And that's about the right amount of time. Although now I'll say I preach 25 to 30, but definitely not anywhere near an hour. And so yeah, I went to this trial lawyer, and basically he's like, write it out and then read it. Don't try to memorize it, just read it.
Yeah.
Like 1,000,000 times. And then take nothing up there. Except maybe if you want to like highlight a couple transitional phrases so you know when to move on to the next thing, but you know it because you read it 1,000,000 times. And then just talk. Just go. And so I did that, and that's the method I still use today, and it's kind of developed into my own style. Like at first I was very much behooving to like his because I sucked and I wanted to be better.
Right, yeah.
But so he gave me that blueprint. But what it has developed into, and now I think I'm a pretty good preacher, but I could have another colleague come along someday and be like, "You suck."
Right.
But is that it's a narrative form. Mm-hmm. So I don't tell people we're done with point A.
Right.
Just like if you're watching a movie, you don't go, okay, it's act 2. I mean, some films do it, but they do it
purposefully.
Like they do it in a creative way. Or if you go to a play, they might, but that's kind of like, but
that's the medium. You expect a play to have the curtain close and
exactly
the drum beat and everyone's arms are up and
right. But and the effect is that when people are done, they're like, I think the way that people receive my sermons, at least from feedback, is like that they experienced something as opposed to they were taught something. And not that they weren't taught, but I think it's more memorable that way.
Yeah.
And so that's just me kind of like inducing my own sort of passion for
you're so postmodern
for my own craft. Do you think that's postmodern? I don't know.
Maybe I think narrative is. Or at least I think conservative.
Yeah,
would label narrative as postmodern.
Yeah, I would separate my style though from like say there is another style that's pretty much just like storytelling.
Yeah,
like so they'll take a passage
like Erwin McManus.
Yeah, they'll take like a passage and then they'll riff off of it with like humorous, engaging, funny stories for half hour, 40 minutes. And you're like, wow, that was a really good time, but you have no idea what the passage means.
Yeah.
And it doesn't really matter what the passage means. That's not what I'm doing or what I'm saying. Like what I'm trying to do, what I'm attempting to do is like immerse people in an experiential way in the text.
Yeah.
And to wrestle with its complexities and to wrestle with its discomforts, and that's what I'm trying to do. So it is like sort of an art rather than...
Yeah, I think it's an art.
Like rather than going up there and being like, I'm an expert in something you guys don't know anything about, so you need me to tell you, as if there isn't like, as if Google doesn't exist. Like as if you can't do a Bible study on your own, you know, online.
Yeah.
Which you could.
Right. Although I think people are really bad at Googling as well.
That's true.
You know?
That's true. And also confirmation bias is a big thing. So it's not like they're going to be like Googling, at least the people at my church, they're not going to be like Googling postmodern or liberal theologians. And likewise, like people in the UCC churches aren't going to be Googling like John MacArthur or taking anything he has to say seriously if that's one of the options that come up. And eventually the algorithm will just like...
Stop.
It'll just lead you to the...
Yeah.
Like, so if you're more liberal, it'll be like, here's Richard Rohr.
Right.
Look at one of his sermons, So there's a point to be made there.
I got into a little bit of a debate on Facebook with a relatively new evangelical Facebook friend who, like, friended me through a mutual friend and whatever. And their post was like, atheism because it's easier to believe that 12 people were martyred for a lie and blah, 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 right? And I'm just like, I'm not an atheist because I was like, it's such an oversimplification. And like, you're also assuming that all atheists are just anti-Christian, where like, I'm also against, like, all the arguments you're using for the historicity of the disciples could be used for the historicity of Muhammad or the historicity of Buddha. Right. And I'm like I reject those arguments as well. Like, my atheism isn't predicated on the fact that I think the disciples were or were not martyred. In fact, like, that comes later. So I like piped in, and they're like, maybe, and I basically said, like, and then someone else said, the Bible is the most proven archaeological book, and there is nothing more true and more provable. And I was like, I don't know, like, Einstein's theory of relativity and quantum mechanics have been shown to be pretty irrefutable. And like, now you're comparing apples to oranges. Like, I meant historical. And I was like, okay, well, I have some other history books that are way more accurate in my estimation. And someone else piped in, and they were like, this might help. And they sent me like 5 different articles from Christianity.com and ChristianityToday.com about like the historicity of the Bible. And I was like, well, like, I don't consider Christianity.com necessarily a neutral...
Not ChristianityToday.com.
No, it was like Christian. I'd have to look it up. I think it was Christianity.com. They sent me a few. But I was like, none of these are neutral. And maybe you can make I think they would make the argument that no archaeologist is neutral, that they're either a believer or they're deceived by Satan and trying to like disprove everything so that we all go to hell. Because that can be like the only... Right, like...
It's a little harsh assigning of motives, but
like, okay, so if you're an archaeologist who's trying to suppress the truth and prove that the Bible isn't real, right, and you're in the evangelical semi-Calvinist world, why are you trying to disprove the Bible? Right, like,
right.
It's because like you've been deceived by Satan, or you know the truth via Romans 1. And then you're trying to convince other people that it's not true as well. So you're like literally leading them into hell.
Yeah.
But anyway,
I gotcha. I misunderstood your...
Yeah. Okay. So anyway, they send me all these links, and I'm like, well, here's these other links that like even the archaeological evidence you're pointing to like doesn't prove the Bible. It proves that Nebuchadnezzar was a person, which like I never said he wasn't. Right. What I said was like, there's no archaeological evidence for the Exodus, and you're giving me all this other stuff, but you're conveniently leaving out the Exodus. And so like my argument isn't all the Bible is false, right? Like there's got to be some truth in there, but
So
I don't know how we got on.
I don't know either, but I'm curious about the archaeological evidence for the Exodus, and I don't want to get too much into it because I think that might be a whole episode of its own.
Probably have to,
like archaeology and the Bible. Which is one I would have to prepare for. but like, so what would count as archaeological evidence for the Exodus would be something like you would expect to find human bones in the Red Sea, like, or close to each other.
So for 40 years they wandered 100 square miles. Right. You'd expect to find some poop, some food waste, some pots that broke, you know, a tent that blew away. Like 1 million people wandering for 40 years in 100 square miles should leave something behind. And we find nothing. So
the other thing I would say is to the argument of 11 men wouldn't die for something that they knew was a lie. Like, they would die for something that they believed it was true, even though it was a lie.
Right.
And also, they would also die for something that they had psychologically convinced themselves was true, for the sake of their own psychological needs. Like,
I mean, and you could even go further. Like, you could even be a supernaturalist and say, like, they saw Jesus do these miracles, but Jesus wasn't God, and that came later. The people claim that he was God, right? Like, there's a lot of other explanations besides, like,
right. Well, even Peter's language in the sermon at Pentecost in Acts 2, the way that he talks about Jesus is really interesting, and it's different than the way by the time you get to the end of the New Testament.
Yeah,
the way people talk about Jesus, like the way John talks about Jesus, is like
the Logos.
The Logos.
Yeah.
It's just like barely like human.
Right.
But like Peter, right after Jesus' resurrection, you know, a month and a half later, he's at Pentecost and he's like, this man named Jesus, whom God raised,
right,
and ascended to the right hand. He actually, in the Greek construction of it is like, almost not absolutely. It's like he made him to be God almost. Like he raised his position. So it's like,
which is kind of, I think, the Mormon stance.
So I don't know that like there was this theological concept of Christ's divinity that was as strong as, say, when Paul wrote Colossians and he says this is the image of the invisible God.
Yeah.
You know, it's not like that was there. That's not how I don't think that's how the disciples were thinking about Jesus when they were walking around with him.
Yeah.
You know, I don't think they thought they were following God. Well, indirectly maybe, but like, you know, God himself wasn't speaking when Jesus was speaking, not to them anyway.
Yeah.
I don't know. I think that's interesting, and it means that they were interpreting Jesus' resurrection in a certain way that was really important for them personally. Like, it was really important for them that they could make him. I want to be careful how I say that. Like theologically, to claim that Jesus was the risen Messiah who brought on the resurrection that the Old Testament was talking about. Mm-hmm. Like that was the bold theological claim that they were making, and the fact that they needed it to be true in order for them to have meaning and purpose to go on, because it was a really traumatic event that they went through, losing their master. Like the fact that they needed it to be true, I think, probably discredits to some degree the argument that 11 men wouldn't die for something that they. Right. It's like, no, they need this to be true.
Well, and in
a very deep way.
Even I want to push on a different angle. Like, even McDowell, not Josh McDowell, but his son, like, readily admits that there is like exceptional historical evidence for Peter and Paul being martyred. He would say good evidence for James, the son of Jesus, and one of the other apostles.
James, the brother.
Yeah.
Or
cousin. Not son.
Or cousin.
Yeah. But for the others, there's very scant evidence, and probably nothing that any Christian should lean on. So like, even some of the top apologists are like, yeah, like it's like colloquial church history that all of the disciples were martyred, but like two others, like it's up in the air, and the rest, like, probably not.
Yeah.
So it's like, even like the meme's even worse.
Yeah. So are you leaning on tradition? Or are you leaning on history? And how far are you willing to go to say that tradition is basically like historical in the same way that like modern people talk about what history is?
Yeah. Well, and I think there's also like how many. Like, there's lots of accounts of the Civil War, right? Mm-hmm. From various people involved, like both North and South, people who disagreed, people in other countries who were observing it from like sort of a more neutral standpoint. So like all that evidence you should weigh more heavily. Mm-hmm. But like if all the history is coming from one source and there's no corroborating sources, like, you should hold that evidence a lot more loose.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And so when it comes to, Thomas being martyred in India, like some of these more minor apostles, like the only evidence comes from a church writing. And there's like with Paul and Peter, there's evidence from their enemies. There's evidence from historians at the time who lived concurrently with them. But there's nothing like that for most of the other apostles. So you're like,
yeah.
Like, is that really, it's like...
Can you say the phrase 11 men wouldn't die for something they knew was a lie with as much confidence as you're saying it?
Right.
That's
yeah. You probably should. You should probably say like 2,
and the one wasn't even there when Jesus was.
Yes.
Right. The one had an experience later on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it's just it's a terrible argument against atheism, right? And gosh, we're like into apologetics. We'll wrap it back into food in a second. Like that argument, which I think people also can't... Oh, this goes back to like Google and blind spots and confirmation bias. Like that argument that people, I think, especially within a specific religious tradition can't see is that argument can be made for other religious traditions, and yet you reject that evidence. Like Muslims are going to say there's historical evidence that Muhammad was the zeal of the prophet, like the zeal of God, the last prophet, right? Like ascended to heaven from the not the Mount and the Dome, the rock in Saudi Arabia.
Yeah.
And I apologize to our Muslim listeners that I can't think of the name right off the bat. But they're going to say there's historical evidence for that, and Christians are going to say no. So, like, it's like what's good for the goose is what's good for the gander. And if you're going to reject evidence of another religious tradition because the evidence is only within that religious tradition, then you probably should not hold very tightly to the historical evidence of your religious tradition if it's only taught within your religious tradition.
Yeah. I hear you.
So, yeah. So I tend to stay out of theological debates online at this point in my life, but for like something like that, I'm like, no, like none of this is like why I'm an atheist or why you should believe in Christianity.
It's really hard to go online in a public space because it's kind of not different than going down the street and like running into somebody that basically telling other people things about you that aren't true.
Yeah.
That's basically what it is.
Right.
It's like, it's one thing to go, somebody shared some meme that I disagree with in the abstract. It's another thing if somebody's like, yeah, so,
No, all pastors are child molesters.
Right. Yeah. Right. If you're a pastor, then you're a pedophile, like, by default. You're like, well...
You're like, I need to set this record straight.
Even then, you're so, like... I would feel so irredeemably biased that I would still feel like the need to couch it in, I see why you think that. From your perspective. And I don't know if that's... I don't know if that's like the Midwesterner in me that just feels like I need to be apologetic for every single thing I've ever done.
Yeah, it sounds like the Midwesterner.
I heard a joke the other day about Canadians apologizing for Winnipeg being so cold. And the guy was like, I forget who it was. No, I think it was Jim Gaffigan. He was like, I'm pretty sure it's not your fault. They're like, we're sorry, Winnipeg is so cold. Yeah. Did you make Winnipeg? Did you place it in the Northern Hemisphere?
Did you choose to bring me to Winnipeg?
Yeah.
And make me endure the...
Right.
Yeah. So yeah, food.
Smooth transition.
Right? So yeah, I mean, I think when we originally recorded this episode, it was because you caught me saying that food's transcendent in a previous episode.
Uh-huh.
And I, like... In the same way that, like, we don't just do the podcast, but we drink coffee and we experience something together. I think food does that.
Oh,
right?
yeah.
Right? So, like, it has this ability to bring people together.
Mm-hmm.
And we even talked, like, how many religious traditions are focused around food?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like, you have communion,
mm-hmm.
right? You have Passover.
Mm-hmm.
You have Ramadan and Eid.
Yeah.
Right? Like... like so much is focused around what we're eating and how we're eating and who we're eating with. Like that there is a transcendent quality to that. And the like eating the best bowl of ramen you've ever had in your life and being like, why is this like so much better than right? Like it does sort of take you out of your body. And my guess is like while you were eating the best ramen of your life, you weren't thinking about like, oh, I have to go home and do laundry and mow the lawn. Like you were just in it in that moment, experiencing something that you couldn't pull off yourself.
Right. Yeah, that's a good word. And it occurs to me that I don't think we ever hang out with people without like some sort of thing to put in our mouth while we do it.
Yeah, it's strange. If
you're like, if you're trying to make a date with somebody, like let's get together and hang out. You're never like just come over to my house and sit on my porch.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose there are like rare circumstances, like maybe just fishing early in the morning. But even then, I feel like you're bringing like a beer
or a thermos, something.
Yeah.
And I don't know what that is. Maybe it's just we need something to break to bridge the gap of like maybe there's something to like maybe it's there needs to be a mediation because like pure confrontation's a little too intense.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, also probably like you eat with your friends, not with your enemies. For the most part, right?
Yeah.
Like prisoners of war don't get the sirloin.
Right.
They're like, here's just enough gruel to keep you alive until we can trade you for our prison. Like,
right. Exactly.
And sometimes not even enough, right? You're like, screw you. You're the other. You're the enemy. You don't get food.
So, like when Jesus says, "Love your enemies," he's basically like, invite your enemies over for dinner.
I mean, if the gospel accounts are to be believed, he ate with Judas.
Right.
Who at that moment, like, is there a worse enemy than someone who's like
about to kill you?
Yeah.
Like, like planning on it, like right there.
Right.
Just sitting around with all your other friends.
Yeah. He's like, I can't wait to kiss this guy, and then the soldiers are going to come and grab him.
Right. So that's intense. And then opens up a whole other thing. But I feel like we're coming to the end here.
I think so. Chesterton, quick.
We could do like a preview of like how we might talk about Chesterton in the future. I brought him up because I've been reading him, and I have an interesting relationship with him because I think that he's a better theologian than he is an apologist. Mm-hmm. But I think he himself would say like he's not a theologian. He's just a fiction writer and a whimsical sort of what's the word I'm looking for? There's a phrase, but I can't find it. He's a satirist. He's a lot of things.
Yeah.
But
I think Lewis is later influenced by his.
Yeah. Like I actually would prefer Chesterton, even though Lewis was very much influenced by him, because just the way that he intentionally comes at it from a different angle. So you can never read Chesterton and go, oh, that's you. There's a lot of times that you read him and you go, I never thought about it that way. I
haven't read much, so
that's the value of it. And even when you disagree, you recognize the sort of genius that's happening there. So I think that atheists will read Chesterton and go, everything he's saying is a straw man, but the way he argues against the straw man he created is like really inventive, and it manages to give people a view of Christianity that for those who are skeptical and those who are outside, they can at least say that that's a kind of Christianity that could possibly be attractive. The rub being if it were true.
Sure. All right. Well, you're going to have to send me something that I should read.
Yeah, I will.
And then
I will
get more into it. If you have recipes you want to send us, food experiences that you feel were transcendent.
Very good.
Just to end, I think we talked about the most transcendent meal I ever had was the 13-course tasting menu at WD-40, which we went with 4 people. Hey, Kurt. And like everyone at the table had to get it because it was like a 5-hour experience. Like when you got up to go to the bathroom, your napkin was refolded into a like crazy shape. There was like 6 servers that just attended. Yeah. And everything was whimsical. Like you can look out, the WD-40 no longer exists because Manhattan got so expensive that like Michelin star restaurants moved out. Mm-hmm. But like the first course was a New York bagel with cream cheese, but the bagel was ice cream that was flavored like an everything bagel, and the cream cheese was like solid and crunchy. So you had all the same texture, but it was reversed, and like the whole meal was whimsy like that. So
yeah, it just means that like food is way more than functional.
Yeah.
For human beings.
Yeah.
I think that's what we conclude. It's way more than functional for human beings. There's something really special about food and the power it has over us.
Yeah, I think so too. Well, share your food stories. Share your other stories. Like, share, tweet, whatever you guys do. And we'll see you next week.